Why just build a model car when you can make it move? Well, I guess I could think of a few reasons. Nevertheless, I'm combining the lifelike aesthetics of a 1969 Chevelle SS with some tiny electronics, attempting to build a one-of-a-kind radio-controlled model with as many real-world details as possible. In today's video, the quest continues, as I'll be attempting to miniaturize these front suspension components that you'd find on the real thing, so they'll work with my tiny DIY muscle car. Just a little high-tech 3D printing, along with some intricate fabrication, seems easy enough, right? Well, about that. Hello everyone and welcome! The 69 Chevelle is back on the bench once again, and just as promised, less than a year since the prior update. With the installation of that MA10 rear axle assembly, along with that rear suspension going so well in that prior video, I'm really hoping to keep that momentum going today as I tackle the front suspension, which I anticipate may be a little more of a challenge. First though, I want to start by giving a huge thanks to all of you for the support and interest on that prior video. I'd also like to go ahead and do a quick overview on the work that I've done so far, just to make sure everyone's up to speed. This project started out with this fantastic 1/25th scale plastic model kit from Revell. The 69 Chevelle SS might be a vintage car, but both the design and tooling for this kit is well under a decade old. Crisp, clean, and well-detailed parts from top to bottom, and there's plenty of them. In the first part of this series, I spent some time not only admiring this well-designed kit of an iconic muscle car, but also explaining my reasoning for using this kit in particular as the base for this custom RC project. Beyond simply replicating an iconic muscle car, the high number of detailed parts and separate frame piece helped to make this kit better suited for a lifelike plastic model to RC conversion. Of course, after that, it was time to actually start building the car, starting with the rear end. Our MA10 rear axle assemblies are perfect for highly detailed plastic model conversions like this due to their true 1/25th scale size. When you're attempting a project with as much detail as this, you really need functional components that are at least close to the same size as the parts that are included in this kit, since I'm essentially just replacing these non-functional styrene parts with ones that actually do the job. Of course, doing this can be a little easier said than done, with high-resolution 3D printing being a huge asset. While we already offer a variety of different sizes and variations of our MA10 axles, I did a few modifications to the design within my CAD software to better replicate the mounting locations of the suspension links and coil springs. After some 3D printing, and with minimal modifications to the frame piece included in the kit being required, I had a fully functional rear axle and factory-style 4-link suspension. In other news, these great-looking wheels and licensed pad-printed tires require absolutely no modifications, as they'll thread right onto the MA10's 2mm axle shaft. It's almost like this plastic model to RC conversion was just meant to happen, but it would be premature to celebrate just yet, as now it's time to tackle the front suspension. As discussed in the prior video, which by the way I'll have linked below in the description, along with the full playlist for this project if you'd like to check out any of those prior videos, I talked a bit about some of the modifications that will be required on the frame to accommodate my own functional front suspension, as obviously the simulated upper control arms which are molded in as part of the frame piece will need to be removed. Clearly some more modifications are going to be necessary for this stage of the project, but with you all caught up on what's happened so far, let's have a closer look at the work that I've done these past couple of weeks. A question that sometimes gets brought up, particularly when I showcase my custom 1980 Jeep J10, which was the subject of the previous long-form video that I posted here on the channel, is what differentiates a chassis like this from a more conventional store-bought RC chassis, and why go to all the effort to make it yourself. Now this makes a bit more sense in the context of that Jeep, as there are a huge number of 1/24 scale crawlers and trail trucks available, both as kits and fully assembled ready-to-run vehicles, whether you're ordering online or at your local hobby shop. The major difference here is scale realism. I don't want to just make this car move, but I also want to make the drivetrain and suspension look at least somewhat close to the real thing. This includes attempting to replicate the overall layout and design of each of the components, blending it in with the chassis and parts included with the plastic model kit. I have showcased a number of projects previously that utilize much more basic chassis designs, such as what you see here. Many of these chassis are highly adjustable, allowing them to fit many different bodies. They're also easier to 3D print, assemble, and are more durable, making them better suited for more powerful RC electronics. Of course, these projects can also be a ton of fun and certainly not nearly as difficult or time-consuming to put together. Now when it comes to ready-to-run vehicles, the Kyosho Mini Z line is a similar size and includes some great-looking bodies. The chassis underneath might not look a lot like a real vehicle, and these cars lack some details like full interiors and engine bays, however they can be modified to be very fast around the track. But with a project like this, it's basically for someone who wants to build a plastic model kit that just so happens to be drivable once complete. The performance of this Chevelle certainly won't be setting the pavement on fire, but I'm hoping whether you're looking at this car from the top or the bottom, it'll look as close to the real thing as possible. It really just depends on what your goals are for a project like this and how much time you want to sink into it. As long as you're having fun, that's what really matters, and personally I love the challenge of a project like this where I'm custom designing all of my own drivetrain and suspension parts. Of course, if I'm going to try to match the suspension on my car to look as close to the real thing as possible, I need to spend some time collecting reference images and doing a bit of research. While the front suspension pieces included in this model kit might not be quite as detailed as the rear, referencing these parts is still going to be very helpful. As I talked about and showcased in the prior video, I did some 3D scans of some of the parts included in this kit, which were extremely helpful for when it was time to design my own functional components in Autodesk Fusion. I used the Moose 3D scanner from 3D Maker Pro to capture this data, and while these parts are maybe a little bit on the smaller end of the spectrum for what the scanner is really designed to capture, it still managed to pick up some of the finer details, enough to make these scans extremely useful. Something I did was scan the bare chassis with nothing installed, and then I did another scan with this piece that contains the lower control arms in place. That way I could then align both of those scans within Fusion to help make sure that the size, shape, and placement of the control arms is at least close to where they need to be. More or less just sort of tracing the outline of the lower control arms. Now as I was progressing with the design, I made sure to gather some reference material to get a good idea of how the real control arms and steering components look. This very simple double control arm design was used extensively by GM during this era. The upper control arm connects to the top of the frame and has some curvature. The lower control arm is larger and more flat, with the coil spring sitting on top, which gets sandwiched between the underside of the frame. On the real cars, there is a shock absorber placed on the inside of those springs, however, I won't be including any shocks on my tiny 1/25th scale model. Of course, there are many different aftermarket high-performance parts manufacturers producing upgraded tubular control arms and modern coilover shocks to enhance the handling characteristics of these cars. For my build though, I'm going for more of a box stock factory Chevelle SS, so I'm going to try and at least somewhat match the appearance of these OEM upper and lower control arms. And again, as I discussed in that prior video, we do currently have a similar style double control arm front suspension assembly called the FC01. This is a fully FDM 3D printable suspension designed for plastic model to RC conversions such as this. A good example of this assembly being used for a project would be that 39 Chevy Coupe that I built. This assembly was very easy to mount to the frame included in the model kit, and it looks right at home for a street rod style build, and it is worth noting that this assembly could be made to work with this model kit as well. While functionally it would work just fine and it would still look pretty good, again I just want something a little bit more OEM in appearance. That said, I did use the FC01 assembly design as the base for this suspension that I'm making here. In the spirit of GM, there will be a little bit of part sharing here, with the steering knuckles being pretty much the same as the ones you'd find on the FC01. The major difference though will be those control arms. Now if you're a crazy person like me and enjoy these super scale plastic model to RC conversions where you're 3D printing your own tiny parts, as I talked about when designing the rear suspension, these parts that I'm designing here are very much tailored to this specific plastic model kit from Revell. This means that if you're interested in using these same parts for a different model kit, be aware that they might not fit nearly as well. I have a feeling that with some work, this front suspension in particular could probably be used for other similar 1/25th scale GM A-body vehicles, but without breaking open the kit and doing any mock-ups with the parts that are included, it's really hard to know for sure how well they might work and how many modifications will be required. With a little bit of work, I can certainly guarantee a great fit with these Revell 68 and 69 Chevelle kits, as I'll be proving in just a minute. However, anything else, I'm really not sure how well they'd work. Only advice I can really give is to print out a set and start doing some mock-ups and see what you think. The design process was overall pretty simple and straightforward, especially since I was reusing some design elements from the FC01. While I did my best to capture the overall shape and appearance of these control arms, obviously they're not an exact match and certainly lack some detail. This is partially due to simply not wanting to invest that much time in the design process to the point where I'm trying to replicate every little curve of these stamped steel OEM control arms, but also to make these parts a little easier to FDM 3D print. For example, I made sure that the lower control arm has a flat bottom to ensure good bed adhesion while printing. I also included provisions for a small screw to be installed near each one of the ball joints. That way, if they're a little loose, you can just tighten them up. As you can see, I also did a little bit of design work on the steering system. I think I've got a pretty good idea of how that's all going to go together, or at least I hope I do, but I'll be diving more into that process in the next video. For now though, here's what I've got for the front suspension. Is it an exact match? Not quite, but I'd like to think it's at least in the ballpark. And once installed on that great looking chassis from Chevelle, along with getting everything painted matte black, I think these are going to blend in pretty well and should look the part. Once the design work was complete, it was time to get everything 3D printed. I FDM 3D printed each of these parts, though I imagine you could achieve an even better appearance using resin. As I've talked about before, make sure that you're using a small size nozzle and have your settings dialed in if you'll be attempting to FDM 3D print these parts. I was able to get some pretty good looking parts with just a little bit of sanding, certainly suitable for this project. I also went ahead and drilled out all of the holes using a small pin vise hand drill. It is clear though that some more modifications are going to need to be made to the front of the frame piece to install that suspension than what was required in the rear. These upper control arms will need to be removed entirely, and then I should be able to reshape the frame rails so they can accommodate the functional RC suspension. At this point though, I've got all the parts that I need and I've got an idea of what modifications I need to do, so it's time to put this plan into action. It's finally time to begin building. I got started by assembling the suspension pieces that I had just 3D printed. By the way, as always, the STL files for these parts will be available on our Patreon if you'd like to print a set for yourself. Just like with the rear wheels, the holes on the front are the perfect size for a piece of M2 hardware to thread right in. I believe this is a 6mm length bolt that I'm using here. Very easy to adapt the wheels included with this kit to work with these custom RC components. The assembly process here is slightly different from our FC01 design. However, I'll go ahead and have links on that page to our FC01 assembly info and tutorials, as for the most part, it's the same process. Really, it's pretty simple to assemble, aside from the fact that these parts are quite small. Just like with the FC01, these tiny ball joints are created using 1mm dowel pins and 2mm jewelry beads. Although tedious to glue together, you quickly and cheaply have a nice ball joint. You can literally get like a lifetime supply of these pieces for under 10 bucks. Again, more information on our FC01 front suspension assembly, as well as links to these non-3D printable parts, are posted on our Patreon, linked below in the description. If you can build an FC01, you can build one of these as well. Only major difference here is I'm using 3 ball joints in total for the lower control arm, with 2 of these ball joints being used to connect the arm to the frame. With the upper control arm, 2 M1 size screws are being used to secure the arm to the frame. An M1.6 size screw will help keep the spring positioned on the lower control arm. Here's a closer look at the completed assemblies. These should fit pretty nicely into place in the spot that the suspension included in the model kit is currently. Of course, a little bit of hacking is going to be required first though. I had a pretty solid plan in place, which I decided to start on the left side of the frame. As you can see, I trimmed off that upper control arm and then sanded the surrounding area smooth. as well as tapered off the edge on the outside so that my functional upper control arm will have some room to move up and down. You can really see it taking shape here, as I now have a nice flat spot to glue that upper control arm mount, though I really needed to taper off and cut away at that outer edge in order to have enough room for everything to move. These upper control arms that I've made here are a little thicker and not quite the right shape due to having a place to insert an M1 screw to tighten the ball joint. But with everything looking good on the left side, I went ahead and did the same thing on the right, trying to make everything look as symmetrical as possible. At this point, the top side of the frame is looking pretty good. I've got a nice flat surface to glue each of the upper control arm mounts to. Of course, I'll need to make sure they're positioned correctly when gluing. Now it's time to add some mounts for the lower control arms. Again, I want to try and make everything as symmetrical as possible here, so I decided to use these mounting holes for the front suspension piece included in the model kit to place one set of ball joints for my own functional control arms. The holes on the frame are definitely a bit larger than 1mm, however I was able to get each of them lined up and glued into place. As you can see here, I've got one corner of that lower control arm snapped in, and I also glued the upper control arm mount into position, although I will end up adjusting that a bit later on. But here you can see that there's plenty of room for the wheels to steer and move up and down, at least with relation to the frame. Now's the really fun part though, and it's time to install the final set of ball joints onto this crossmember. There really isn't anything I can use for reference here, and when I position this final ball joint, it's going to have an impact on where the front wheel is positioned. Obviously, I want these front wheels to be aligned correctly right within the center of the wheel well and not sticking out too far in relation to the body, so no real precise science here, just sort of measure twice, drill once, that type of thing. I find it helpful to create a pilot hole by heating up a pin and then pressing it through the plastic before drilling it out to a larger size and then gluing the ball joint into place. I know it might not seem like much, but some care is certainly required to ensure everything is being glued into the correct spot. But look at that, the suspension is really starting to come together and look pretty scale. That wheel seems to be correctly positioned within the wheel well, and the camber is at least close to where I would like it to be. Of course, keep in mind that on a real Chevelle, the wheels wouldn't be pushed out all the way to the edge of the fenders like how a lot of modern cars would be. They would instead be inset just a bit, as with most cars from this era. The rear track width is just a little larger than what I think it should be, so I will be fine-tuning that a bit later on, but so far it's looking good. It certainly took a little more work than what was required in the rear, but those suspension parts are really looking right at home on the front of this chassis. It does appear that a little bit of material will need to be removed within the wheel wells to allow enough room to steer, but not much further work should be required, which is exactly how I want it to be. There are a few things that I'll end up adjusting a little later on, but with the left side of this chassis looking good, I went ahead and repeated this process for the right. Once again, really making sure that the wheel is aligned correctly within the wheel well, just trying to be patient throughout this process and paying close attention to where I'm positioning each mounting point for the control arms. Now with the right side suspension components now installed, I did a little bit of careful evaluation, and although looking pretty good overall, I decided I wanted to make a few minor tweaks. As you could probably tell, the camber angle is a bit off, and I also wanted to raise the height of the upper control arm mount, as the steering knuckles are a little too tall in relation to where the upper and lower control arms are positioned. It's not like I'm going for perfect suspension geometry here or anything like that, but just want to try and make things look a little better. So I went ahead and made a few alterations to the design, including increasing the height of the upper control arm mount and making various different length adjustments to the upper control arms so I can fine-tune the camber. If you find yourself in a similar situation, I have included these various different sizes in the STL files pack, so hopefully you can get everything fine-tuned and looking how you want. Not really ideal to have to 3D print various different size pieces and then install them one by one to see which one looks the best, but with just how tiny everything is here and really wanting to make everything as compact and lifelike as possible, just 3D printing some different size parts is probably the solution that makes the most sense. In a matter of minutes, I had some new pieces that I could get installed and see how they look. Of course, I had to carefully break off the old upper control arm mounts. Fortunately for once, I was thinking ahead and made sure not to use too much glue to secure them. I then did some sanding on that surface just to make sure that it was flat and no remnants of the glue is still there before gluing the new mounts into place, again trying to make sure everything is as symmetrical as possible. As you can see, I also 3D printed a set of upper spring mounts, which I'll be gluing to the underside of the frame since I had to hack away quite a bit of material from the hole that was originally there for the springs. I know it might not look like much, but it is kind of stressful trying to make sure that the suspension parts are positioned correctly. There's really no guides or screw holes or slots or anything like that. You just kind of have to pay close attention and do the best you can. Eventually though, I got these new parts installed, and as you can see, the camber is definitely looking better with these slight adjustments. As you can see, I have a couple of 3mm outer diameter springs installed. I'm not worried about messing with the ride height just yet, as the weight from the RC electronics and the rest of the model kit is going to affect the front suspension, so I'll fine-tune that more towards the end of this build. At this point, I just wanted to take a moment to admire the front suspension as it stands so far. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I think all of the hardcore scale nerds out there will appreciate the attempt at duplicating the lifelike appearance. I'm also really happy that no modifications were required to this portion of the inner fenders. There's just enough room for those upper control arms to move up and down. However, as I said earlier, I think some material may need to be removed from a few spots in the wheel well to allow the front wheels to steer, especially when the suspension is compressed. Aside from that though, the car should have a pretty good steering angle, and I don't think much if any sanding on the fenders will be required. I did go ahead and install a few M1 screws into some of the ball joints that I felt were a little loose, tightening them up just enough to ensure that the joint doesn't become disconnected, but not too much to where the joint becomes too stiff. Having a look at the front suspension pieces included in the model kit reveals a pretty similar overall size and shape. I thought I'd try getting a little fancy here and see if I could cut off the sway bar to make it work with the suspension that I have here, and I also cut off this little center section on the crossmember so it would fit in the middle. Just trying to retain as many lifelike details as possible. I'm not really sure that the sway bar is going to fit once I install the steering, but at least I added that little piece that goes in the middle. The final thing I did was print out a bunch of spacers that I could use for the rear. Like I said, the track width was a little bit too wide in the rear, so these spacers allowed me to fine-tune that so I can ensure it's precisely lined up with the front. Not a huge difference by any means, but it's that little bit of extra effort that really helps produce a better quality model once complete. It certainly took some time and a little patience, but I'm really happy with the finished result. While it's still pretty far from being finished, I still wanted to get this car out and get a few shots under the sun. Just daydreaming of how this car is going to look once I get everything painted, but already I'm really happy with how the suspension looks and how this car is sitting currently. The width of the wheels, front and rear, looks good. The ride height looks right. I think I've got a pretty good foundation put into place, and now I'm starting to think about the drivetrain and steering. The drivetrain shouldn't be too difficult, as I'll be positioning the motor and gear assembly somewhere around here, and then I think there'll be just enough room for the drive shaft with little to no modifications being required to the undercarriage, depending on how low I'm able to mount the motor. From a functional standpoint, it should be pretty simple, but then of course I want to see how I can modify that 396 V8 included in the kit to fit around that N20 motor. We'll see how much of that detailed engine I'm able to retain when all is said and done. And then a little fabrication will probably be required up front to get the steering servo and idler arm positioned where they need to be, and I'll have to do my best to make sure that they're as out of sight as possible. More on that to come in the next video, but once those two things are checked off the list, it should be pretty smooth sailing from there. Wiring up those tiny electronics is never my favorite part of these projects. However, it's at least a pretty straightforward process with regards to where all the wires need to go, and although the small size of these components makes them more difficult to deal with, it does make them easier to hide. It was suggested in the comments of that previous video, and I have thought about doing this as well, but I might go ahead and cut open the trunk and make that openable to have a nice spot to store the battery, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. I'll figure that out later. I know just installing these front suspension parts might not seem like all that much work or that it would take very long, but it was a little stressful trying to make sure everything was aligned correctly, but I think the results were definitely worth it. Sometimes it takes a little while to do something right, but at least I didn't have to waste a bunch of time reassembling everything 10 times until I finally got what I wanted, as I have had to do with some previous projects when I was less experienced with these types of builds. And not to toot my own horn too much here, but we really do have some nice components and chassis designs available for 3D printing, which have proven to work very well for these types of custom builds. Though of course I've also enjoyed the process of really tailoring the design of these parts to fit the specific 69 Chevelle even better. If I was to build another one of these cars, I'm not sure there's really anything I would do differently next time. As I showed earlier, I did go ahead and create some additional size parts so I could really fine-tune that camber, and obviously this suspension geometry here isn't exactly perfect, but it'll work well for this type of super scale model build. As always, a huge thanks everyone for sticking with me and following along with this project. If you're interested in utilizing these parts for your own build or simply want to support these videos, I'll have our Patreon linked below in the description. I'm not only including the STL files, but I also have some links to some of the relevant pages related to our FC01 suspension, as like I said, the assembly process and non-3D printable parts used is very similar to that assembly. As always though, if you're doing a project similar to this and have any questions, please don't hesitate to send a message. Apologies for the delay between uploads here, just been a little busy with other things, but I've already gotten started on the next update in this series, so hopefully it won't be too long of a wait before that next video will be ready. In the meantime though, leaving a like is always appreciated, and be sure to subscribe if you're interested in staying up to date on this project and all of the other RC builds I've got in the works. As always, a huge thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll see you next time.